Okay, well, I will welcome you folks who are listening and watching, and thank you for attending. We're going to talk a little bit about Lean Startup today, just a little bit about myself. So you have an orientation. I actually have a degree in theoretical biophysics, a PhD, but I'm not a physicist. I've been involved in co-founding things at universities. I've been involved with state biotech organizations, co-founded a bunch of companies all over the place. I've been CEO of another bunch of companies. I've won some awards over my time, and I currently advise companies in Taiwan and Nairobi, Kenya, and in the United States and Mexico as well. And I sit on a number of non-governmental organization boards, and I've lectured a lot at different universities. I'm currently working diligently with four startups listed here. And as you can see, they're kind of all over the place. I have two academic positions, one in Richmond, Virginia, and one here locally where I live in Guadalajara, Mexico at the Pan American University, and I teach full courses. And this is one lecture from those courses. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to start talking about something called business model canvas, which is frequently taught in business schools. And I'm going to move from that to something which might be more useful to people called lean canvas. And then we'll talk a little bit about why startups fail and link that to the main body of the talk, which is a method for thinking about startup companies called Lean Startup. And it's really the best method I'm aware of. And there's a take-home message. But normally in business school, they talk about business model canvas. And as you can see from the screen here, there's about 8 different areas you need to think about. And basically, you put up your guesses, As an example, if you had this kind of a business you were starting, and I had this one as a child, okay. So if you were doing a business model canvas, you might ask, well, who's the customer segment? Well, people visiting the park. This is a stand near the park. And then what am I offering? Well, my value proposition is good lemonade. And that's very, very common to have such things, believe it or not, in Mexico as well as the US. I can't speak for Morocco, of course. How do I get the lemonade to the customers? Well, I sell it at the booth. And also maybe I have a website because these kids are smart. The relations are strictly personal. People come to your booth. Where do I get my money from? Well, I sell lemonade and maybe I get tips. I am also involved. I might need to get a permit from a local city to have such a stand. And I've got to make lemonade. I've got to sell it, maybe market it. I need ingredients. I need maybe some salespeople. I need a booth and equipment. And my cost structure is pretty simple. I buy equipment. I buy some ingredients. I pay myself some salary, and maybe we have some advertising flyers. So that's the concept of business model canvas. And that's very commonly taught in business schools. To give you an example, Uber, you may have heard of these folks. They're in Marrakech and also in Casablanca. They're one of the largest taxi services in the world, and they're all over the place. And they have a business model. What's interesting about their business model, and I'm not going to go through this with you, is that their value proposition is to customers like you and me who want to have a taxi coming quickly and taking me to wherever I need to go. But also their second is drivers, because they don't have professional drivers. Anybody can be an Uber driver as long as you have a decent car. And so the drivers are their clients too. So it's an important concept. But if you're an entrepreneur, if you're starting a company, this may not be the best way to think about it. For example, entrepreneurs become entrepreneurs because they see a problem somewhere. And they say, okay, I think I can solve that problem. I've got a good solution. And you got to know how is that the potential customers deal with the problem today. And in the business model canvas, it's missing something very important. When you're thinking about starting a business, you need to understand who the competition is. Okay. So the competition is not who you think they are, but who your customers think they are. These are missing from the business model canvas. So there was a fellow named Ash Moira, who said, we can take this business model canvas and turn it into something called lean canvas. And why it's called lean canvas, I'll talk about in a moment. And I need to just replace 4 of these boxes with different things. The first one is key partners becomes what's the problem or the top problems that I'm solving, that I'm proposing to solve. The second change is take key activities and say, okay, what is my solution to these problems? The third is not key resources, but how do I know I am heading in the right direction in providing this solution? You need measurements or metrics. And last but not least, where they had relationships, what is your competitive advantage? What is it you're bringing to this customers that nobody else has and gives you an advantage in the marketplace? And he calls that lean canvas. And I'm not going to take you through this in any detail, except to say it's an output of something which we're going to talk about as the main topic today. But it's interesting if you kind of divide this canvas in half. Things on the left are kind of talking about the product or the service, and things on the right are kind of talking about the market. Just an interesting observation. So here's a question to ponder. What happens to most startups? Okay, and this is true anywhere in the world that these startups occur. Well, I think we all know the answer to that. They don't do well. In the US, which arguably has the United States, one of the best entrepreneurial ecosystems on the planet, in the United States, 50% of new startup companies survive only 1 year. After 2 years, only 20% are still alive. And after 5 years, over 98% have died. And this is in a place with a very good ecosystem. So the question would be, why? Well, there are reasons why startups fail. The most important reason is the marketers call it lack of product market fit. What that means is that they are building something that the market really doesn't want. Okay, in fact, 42% of the time startups fail because of this. It's the largest reason. Sometimes they run out of cash. That happens 29%. They don't hire the right people. That happens about a quarter of the time. They don't have a good business model a little bit of the time, and they don't even know what marketing and sales is about. And most often, startups fail not just because one of these, but because of 2 or 3. But the largest reason is they don't know what the market really wants. And so there's a fellow named Eric Ries, who I'm going to talk about, who's the inventor of Lean Startup. His answer is startups fail not because they fail to build what they set out to build, but because they waste time, money, and effort building the wrong product or the wrong service. And a startup, according to Eric Ries, is a human institution designed to create a new product or service under conditions of uncertainty, extreme uncertainty. And like I said, he's the creator of this statement. And he's the one who developed something called the Lean Startup model. And it was not proposed that long ago, 2008. And he was a software development engineer. And his first book that he wrote in 2008 had to do with software development companies primarily. But then he expanded that concept in 2011 to apply to any kind of a company looking to introduce new products or services, big or small. And it's based kind of roughly on, he called it Lean Startup because it was a very famous example of a company, Toyota. I think you all know who Toyota Motors are. Who had developed something they called lean manufacturing way back in the 1960s. And the issue for so Eric Ries writes a book called Lean Startup. And what he does, the basic idea of this book is to eliminate wasteful practices. Don't spend your money on the wrong things, and increase practices that create value during the time you're developing your product, okay? And that increases your chances for success. And the reason he called it Lean Startup was because of a fellow at Toyota Motors in the 60s, Taiichi Ono, who developed a concept called lean manufacturing. And I know none of you speak Japanese, but Toyota is a motor car company. It was a small company, but the largest one in Japan at the time. And they introduced their products into the United States, which was at the time the largest market. And they failed miserably. And they didn't have good vehicles. So Mr. Ono was tasked with figuring out what was going on. And he studied manufacturing practices all over the world, including the US. And he discovered that there were successful ways to think about manufacturing cars. And so one of them was, let's say you're on the assembly line, the cars are coming down, and your job is to put the dashboard on the car. So a car comes down, it doesn't have a roof, you put the dashboard in and you screw it in, and it goes on to the next person who puts something else in. Let's say after 2 or 3 times, the dashboard doesn't fit right. Well, what do? You put it in as best you can, screw it in. But if you continue to do this is a problem. And it used to be Toyota would ignore the problem and the customer would find the problem. But under lean manufacturing, there were many practices he described, but one was this word in Japanese means handle. It's andon. And andon means when, let's say you're that person 2 or 3 times in a row, these dashboards do not fit. You reach up, pull the andon, and everything stops. Manufacturing stops, the whole plant stops. A quality team comes and you've got to figure out what goes wrong, okay? And you don't start again until you figure out what's wrong, okay? So it was called lean manufacturing. His lean startup model has 3 main points. It favors little experiments over big plans. Nobody besides maybe a venture capitalist or Soviet Union requires 5-year plans to forecast very difficult unknowns. It favors customer feedback over your intuition. Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, said everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Business plans quite often don't survive the contact with customers. It favors iterative product design and development over some upfront big design. Startups are not small versions of large companies. If they're going to succeed, they got to figure out what's wrong, figure out in front of the customer, go from failure to failure, figure out what's right, and move as quickly as possible. And if you read the book by Eric Ries, it's just a bunch of stories. And it's really interesting and kind of fun. And it mostly refers to software development. But what I've done is made a little flow chart out of this. And there's really 4 components that constitute this model. One is your idea, the problem you're solving, say your vision. The second is the strategy you're going to use to figure out how you're going to make a product. Then you test that strategy, then hopefully you're heading in the right direction and you grow. So once you've defined your problem and your solution to the problem, you create a strategy, you have certain assumptions about what's going on in the market out there, and you form a hypothesis, okay? Then you need to test that hypothesis or optimize it. And there's a testing module here where you build something, you measure something, you get something in front of clients, you measure it, you get data, you learn something, and you go back and improve it, okay? And then, and you may decide you need to change direction, but if you're going in the right direction, you want to pursue it. So you have your idea, you have your vision. How do you validate your strategy? Well, he calls these assumptions leap of faith, meaning we don't know until we check, until we validate them, whether they're any worth anything. How do you do that? You talk to people, okay? And the people that you talk to, potential customers, do they really have the problem that you think they do? How do they approach that problem today? Is your idea perhaps better? And this is in itself a process concept called ideation, which I'm not going to talk about today, but it's part of my course. So going back to the lean canvas, the assumptions you have, the value assumptions relate to how good are you able to define a problem that people want a solution for? Is your solution a good solution? And then if you can deliver that and you have a competitive advantage, you can grow. Okay. So then you have your strategy, you validated your assumptions, and you formed a hypothesis. Now I need to test this. Okay. And he calls this the build, measure, learn feedback loop. In other words, you have your strategy. So what you do is you build something, a product, and then you get that in front of people, get some data, and go back and learn something and maybe rebuild. So what do you build? Well, he calls this tuning the engines, and you want to do this quickly. What are you building? You're building something called a minimum viable product. If you've been in a startup or you've been involved in university competitions, you'll hear the word MVP all the time. This is where this comes from. So what's a minimum viable product? Well, it's the convergence of a minimum product, which nobody would want, and maybe the full viable product, which everyone is going to want, is your minimum viable product. And let me give an example. If you wanted to start, for example, a shoe sales company online, well, what do you need? I mean, where do most of us go to buy shoes? We might go to a store or a department store or a shoe store. But here's the idea. I want to do this online, okay? And what might it might be you need shoes, right? And you need a website. Those are the two things you need. Well, the example I'm going to give you is of a company, very famous company in the United States called Zappos. When they started their business, which is many years ago, they realized they had to have a website. They had to have a place you could go and order shoes online. But they didn't know what kind of shoes people wanted to buy. So what they did was very simple. They went to shoe stores and they took pictures, photographs of all the different kinds of shoes and put these on their website. And then if you would order a shoe from them, they didn't have it in stock. They would go to the store and buy a shoe, let's say for it was a $50 pair of shoes and they were going to sell it for $30. They would go and buy the shoe for $50 and sell it to you for $30. And sounds like a dumb idea. And in fact, in 2 years, they lost $5 million doing this. But they were figuring out what people wanted. And then when they knew what people wanted, what shoes were being ordered, then they ordered the shoes that people wanted and had inventory and had a warehouse and all of that. And they became very big, very successful. And now they sell lots of things besides shoes, clothing and home goods and all kinds of things. But that was their MVP. Okay. So you need to measure something. In the case of Zappos, it was what kind of shoes people were buying. But Eric Ries says, there are two kinds of metrics. There are metrics that enable you to take action, and then there are metrics that don't really help you. An actionable metric allows you to make a decision. Am I heading in the right direction? A vanity metric, it might make you feel good, but doesn't offer guidance. Good, you feel awesome, but not really able to make any decisions based upon that measurement you're taking. Here's an example. This is just a graph of, it's a website, and what happens is people come to this website, doesn't matter what it is, and you see what's on the website, and the idea is that you would order a service, a subscription from that website. And here's one metric. How many people are visiting the website every day over a couple-week period? Well, you can see a lot of people visited, a lot of unique people. And if you were the CEO looking at that metric, you would say, my goodness, things are going really well. Well, there's another metric. Of those people who come to the website and view it, how many orders are placed? And look what happens. Same period of time, couple-week period of time, everything's going well, and then boom, it goes down to basically zero. Different metric. your action is going to be, what's going on? Did my website go down? Well, maybe not. Did a competitor come in with a better service offering? You need to find out. This metric you need to take action on. This metric is a vanity metric. Okay? So then, let's say you are doing this and doing this. You're building, measuring, learning, and going back and improving and building. And at some point, you need to say, am I heading in the right direction? Is my original hypothesis correct? Or do I need to change? Okay, in other words, my strategy here that I've been testing, okay, do I need to go somewhere? And the question you have to ask is, are we making sufficient progress to believe that our original strategic hypothesis is correct? Or do we need to make a major change? There's only 3 answers. If the answer is no, we're heading in the right direction, keep going. The answer might be maybe. Well, then if it's maybe, you better get better metrics because you're not measuring the right thing. If the answer is yes, we do need to make a change. People don't like what we're showing them. Then you execute what's called a pivot. And that's a very common term in the industry. And a pivot is nothing more than a structured course correction designed to test a new hypothesis about the product or the strategy or the engine of growth. And if you read his book, there are, dozens of different kinds of pivots. But I thought I would give you an example from several examples of the most important pivots. There's something called a zoom in pivot. When you thought you had of many features of a product, but people only want one, zoom into one. And the example there is PayPal. I'm sure you're all aware of PayPal. It's an online service for making payments for all kinds of things. Originally, when they started, they were looking at doing this with computers and the internet, but they were looking more to do it with other kinds of devices which people had at the time called personal digital assistants, which weren't smartphones or anything like that, but they were connected to the internet. You keep your schedules on it. And ultimately, they found that people wanted to do their payments on an internet website. They didn't want to do it on their personal digital assistant, so they zoomed in and offered that on internet, on your computer. And ultimately, of course, we do it with smartphones today. There's another kind of pivot, which is the opposite, a zoom out pivot. You thought you had a whole product in what you were offering, but people wanted something bigger and more. And the great example of that is YouTube. I'll bet you don't know how they started, but YouTube was not YouTube when they originally started. They were an online dating site. So you could go onto an online dating site if you wanted a date, and you could type out all of the information about yourself, and maybe somebody would see that and want to date you. YouTube's idea, and they didn't call it YouTube, it was called Tune In, Hook Up, was that you could put a video of yourself on the site. You put that video on, and the people you were interested in, ladies or men or whatever, would see you and say, oh my goodness, I want to date that person. That was their idea. And they started Tune In, Hook Up, and sure enough, people started posting videos. But not all the videos were dating videos. They started posting videos of crazy things like automobiles crashing or a cat falling off of a refrigerator or crazy stuff like that. And pretty soon it turned out that those crazy videos were 90% of all the videos. So YouTube said, okay, we're going to pivot. We're not just a dating site. We're a post the video you think you like site. And that's how they became YouTube. Another is a customer segment pivot, where you're building something, but the customer segment really wants something else. And the great example of that is Viagra. As many of you may know, it's a pill for erectile dysfunction. And originally it was not built for that. It was built for a treatment of heart pain called angina, and Pfizer pivoted and found out it could work and became the largest selling pharmaceutical of all time. Another is a customer need, where customers don't need the product you're building, but another that you can build. And here's the example. I think you have Starbucks in Morocco. They're all over the world. There are 20,000 of them around the world, maybe more. They originally started off as a coffee shop in Washington, Seattle, but their product was not coffee. Their product was you came to the store to buy things to make coffee with, like a coffee pot or cups or beans or whatever you wanted to make coffee, but they didn't sell coffee. And in the 80s, they were only 6 stores, and they were sold to a fellow who said, you know what people want? They want a real good cup of coffee, and they'll pay for that. So they converted their stores to places where you could buy all those things for sure, but you could also get a really good cup of coffee. And that's when they exploded. So that was the customer need was different, and they had a great CEO who perceived that. Another is a channel pivot, very important pivot, where how you get your product to people can alter the success of that product. I'll bet you nobody have heard of Borders. I'm sure none of you have heard of Borders. It used to be the largest bookstore in the world. And ultimately, online books became very popular through outfits like Kindle, and Borders went out of business. Now, there are still bookstores around, but if you walk into a typical bookstore, a big one, say in a mall, you'll see that they sell books and coffee and all kinds of crazy things. Another example, you probably have not heard of this company, Blockbuster. They were primarily in North America, but they sold, if you wanted to have a video, a movie, like on a CD, you could come to Blockbuster and rent a CD for the night and bring it back the next day and watch your movie you wanted to see. Well, they got eliminated by an outfit called Netflix, which did it by mail first and then ultimately changed that and did it with streaming services. One that is very common today, lots of department stores around that don't exist. Sears happens to be in the United States. Liverpool is one in Mexico. Along comes online services. Sears is out of business. Liverpool is failing. So again, it's how you get one type of pivot is how you get your product or service to the customers. So let's say that you've pivoted, maybe you're and heading in the right direction. You're happy with your product and you're ready to grow it. Well, according to Eric, there are 3 engines of growth. There's sort of the standard where you have advertising and marketing and advertising, and maybe you do it digitally, maybe you don't. And as long as the lifetime value of the client that you obtain through this standard procedure is greater than how much a customer acquisition costs, that's good. And people still do that. But there's other more subtle ways these days to grow. One is a viral way. And the example of that is Hotmail. Hotmail, you probably are familiar with this. It was the very first service 20 years ago where you could send an email for free. If you had an internet account, you wanted to send an email to your friend, you had to buy a service. And they were different in different countries. In the United States, it was called America Online. And Hotmail had the idea that, well, let's do this for free, and there's other ways we can monetize this. And they started and they advertised, and they had 20,000 customers after 6 months. Then they did something very clever because they weren't doing very well. Let's say I had a Hotmail account and I was sending an email to one of you, and you had a paid account. When I send you my email message, Hotmail would put at the bottom of that message, P.S. Would you like a free email account? Here's the link to go to. And of course, why wouldn't you want a free email account? And so you'd go that link. They went from 20,000 to 80 million customers in 6 months. Viral marketing, where the customers do quite a bit of the marketing, people like me who were customers. So that's a way. Another is having a service or a product that people love and don't want to go away from. By the way, that Hotmail example is called the engine of growth pivot. And if you're familiar with games, so games computer games are really addictive. And a lot of people are addicted to World of Warcraft. So as an example. Okay, let me give you a big company example. I mean, it's not just for startups. General Electric, big international company, all over the world, a lot of revenues. They decided, and a lot of different products, from refrigerators to battery systems to jet engines. They decided to convert all of their research to this technique, which they called FastWorks. Based upon lean startup principles, they hired Eric Ries to train people, and by the end of 2014, they had 5,000 R&D people trained in the technique, and they launched their projects. I'll give you one example of what it helped them. They had a line of refrigerators, and they were called Signature, or a Monogram. That was their high-end line, and people were interested in the kind of refrigerator where there were two doors opening. It's called a French door, and they thought, well, we should offer that. So they wanted to create a refrigerator had two doors. So they started with a minimum viable product, tested with customers in 2013. By a year later, they were on version 6 of their MVP. And by October of 2014, they had been through 10 versions. They had customers who loved it. They launched it in 2015. So you say, so what? That took a long time. Well, that might take a long time to you or me or an entrepreneur, but when they used to do this kind of change in a product, it took them 5 years to get it from concept to launch. And so this was done in 2 years, and it cost them 50% less. And they've converted all their various divisions and product to FastWorks because it helps them move more quickly. So the next step in Eric Ries's world is that entrepreneurism is not just for startups. And he wrote another book in 2018 called The Startup Way. And this, where he argues that entrepreneurship and looking at lean startup is a fundamental discipline of every enterprise. It doesn't matter whether you're big like General Electric or small like an entrepreneurial startup. And he defined what he called a modern company compared to an old-fashioned company. That is not using lean startup. An old-fashioned company, steady growth, discipline, management controls, a lot of short-term pressure if it's a public company. A modern company, you just keep innovating. You just keep making better products. Focus on long-term results. A modern, old-fashioned company operates big R&D programs. A modern company operates rapid experiments. An old-fashioned company has a lot of multitasking, marketing and sales and R&D and who knows, working together. A modern company has something called the internal startup, filled with believers who are dedicated to one project at a time. As the word is intrapreneur, inside of a company, entrepreneur. An old-fashioned company has managers and people they boss. A modern company has leaders and entrepreneurs within they empower. An old-fashioned company spends a lot of time building barriers to entry. A modern company just keeps innovating and leaves its competitors in the dust because they keep on making better innovations. So what does this mean for you and your careers? We're going to finish up. Well, a lot of people look at entrepreneurship as kind of like jumping off of a cliff, right? And you're not sure where you're going to land. And oftentimes, as I explained earlier, this is where entrepreneurs land. Because 98% of entrepreneurial startups fail. But I would argue, and there are people who have data, if you are able to successfully apply these lean startup principles in your entrepreneurship startup, this is how you're going to land. This is you. You're innovating, you're constant, you're always ahead of the competition. This is your competition, never going to come and eat you. Okay, so I finished sort of a conceptual discussion. If you need to reach me personally, you can reach me at my Virginia Commonwealth University email. And this is just my advertisement for Mexico, where I live. This is looking out of the rear of our house. We live on a gigantic lake. And that mountain across the way of that lake is about 3,000 meters in altitude. So there's a lot of mountains down here. So if you come to Mexico, you will enjoy it. So I thank you for your time, and if there are any questions or concerns, I'm happy to address them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brandon Price. We have enjoyed your session, me personally, as usual, because you speak of a topic that is very close to home, and that is entrepreneurship. I do want to engage myself in that as time goes on. Now, I've got a few questions, one of which is, when it comes to entrepreneurship, you've spoken of a lot of aspects that come up, and one of them is like pivots, primary types of pivots. Now, the question is, when you're doing a study on a particular project that someone wants to engage in, are you able to see beforehand some aspects that might be pivots, or it just happens by chance or by providence? You cannot really study or understand it in advance to say, okay, this might be a pivot in the future. Is it just automatically, or is there a way of
Well,
knowing?
no, there's a process, and the way of knowing is something called, and this is very commonly seen, is you have an idea, right? You haven't done anything yet, and you see a problem. You think you have an idea it's going to solve the problem. You go through a process of this. When I showed that slide, it was validating assumptions. You talk to potential customers. And I sit as a judge on a very large university competition in Houston. In 2 weeks, I'll be there, and I'm reviewing some of the business plans and every one of them, they go through a customer discovery. So I'll give an example. One example is they're building a device for infants who are in intensive care units to take all the measurements that are needed to be taken by one tube instead of lots of tubes and patches. And it's a very clever idea. So they've talked to 300 surgeons who are pediatric surgeons in intensive care units and say, here's our concept, here's our idea, what do you think? And they've obtained, you can do this for any, they have already obtained the information they need to construct the very first device and try to test it in humans and in infants. And so you need this customer discovery is a very important part. You think you got a good idea, you think the market is going to like it, but talk to the market. Now, do you have to do 300 discussions? No, not really. But then it depends upon what the product is and what the market is, right? I mean, but you do need to talk to potential customers. And you're starting that build, measure, learn. So then they're going to build a primitive version of that device and see how it works in a clinical trial with animals, actually, not with the human babies. And that's what you need to go through. That's the validating your assumptions part. And it's very important to do that, because you may be the smartest person in the world, and you may have great ideas, but until you talk to potential customers, you don't know what they think. Okay.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Zinab, and she says, what makes lean setup approach different from traditional business methods?
Well, in traditional business, in large businesses, people think they know what the customer wants. General Electric would spend 2 or 3 years designing a dual open refrigerator, and then they would build them and put them in inventory and maybe have 10,000 in inventory, and then they would start to sell them, right? They'd go crazy with advertising and look at this General Electric monogram, but maybe they had the wrong finish on the outside, or maybe the lights inside were not good. Who knows? And when they did their lean startup using that, they tested everything, finishes, they tested ease of opening, size of doors, size of the freezer compartment at the bottom versus the refrigeration. They tested all those things. So with customers, and when they started, and they went through a lot of iterations, and when they launched, they knew what customers wanted because customers told them. So big companies all the time are making mistakes. I mean, there's a lot of great examples in the automotive industry where they make huge mistakes. They think they know what the customers want, but they don't. And so you really do. And now big companies may argue this, and there are many big companies that design, jets, for example. Boeing knows what they want, but they do a lot of customer discovery work, right? And they've got to pay attention to size of seats and leg room and all this kind of stuff. So, but for an entrepreneur, where you've never Boeing has been building jets for 100 years. Entrepreneurs haven't been doing their thing for 100 years. They need information. So it behooves big companies to do this. I don't think Boeing uses lean startup to introduce a new jet. They probably know their customers are few, maybe 30 or 40 airlines, and they probably in touch with them all the time and know exactly what they're looking for. So.
Yeah, just to add on to that, when it comes to, is it sometimes that the customer is wrong? For example, there have been ideas that were rejected at first, and then with time, it seems it catches on, and then people sort of like latch onto those ideas. In the first time, it was like negative, and then so how do you, as an entrepreneur, foresee such ideas?
A very simple answer: statistics. Right. If your idea is my university, a university I used to teach at here, one of the student ideas was they had 17,000 students on one campus and no restaurants. So the idea was, well, let's put a restaurant, let's have tacos or something for the students. And they talked to 100 students and they thought it was a good idea. It's a big campus. You have to go off of campus. It was in the city, and it turned out the students really didn't want it because there were so many restaurants available to them within 5-minute walk. So they thought they had a good idea, and it would seem like, but you need to talk to enough people to feel very confident about your idea. But it's more than them saying, "I want a restaurant." It's them saying, "I want a restaurant that serves this kind of food." And if you talk to 100 potential students, say, who would be customers, and 80 of them said the same thing, "I want this kind of food," you have a pretty good chance that you're going to be successful when you open your restaurant. So you got to listen to what they have to say. And what happens in this, as this is the build, measure, loop process, right, that I was referring to, pivots all the time. Companies pivot. And in fact, companies pivot all the time, even after they've been in the market, right, with a product. It isn't doing so well, so they just something, and quite often they pivot in as a reaction, not to something they didn't know, but to a new appearance of something in the market, right, that they didn't know was coming, and they have to pivot away from that, or pivot to address that. So it's a continuous process, but it starts with entrepreneurs doing customer discovery. So.
Okay, then let's talk about something else that one of our followers are asking. And they're asking about thinking about scaling and fundraising. When is the right time? When would you advise? When do you think is the right time to think about scaling and or fundraising? Like how do you?
Well, okay, sure. In fact, my students are doing that right now in my course in Virginia. They're doing what you need to create is a financial model. Let's talk about fundraising first. That you predict, you understand how much you understand your markets, you understand how you're going to penetrate those markets, you understand what the market size potentially is, who the competitors are, why you better, and you develop a revenue model, say over 3 or 4 years. And then you also have to develop an expense model, right? Okay, if I'm going to launch my product at the end of next year, I need to spend X number of dollars or whatever in terms of R&D, and I need to have an office somewhere. You need to get your expenses down. And all of that goes into a document, a financial document, which is called a cash flow document. In other words, not a P&L, not a profit and loss, but cash flow. So that means you've got cash coming in and you've got cash going out for your expenses. And normally people who start companies do this. They don't do it on an annual basis. They do it maybe every month for the next year or two, or every quarter for the next year or two. And as your revenues, as you develop your expenses to start up, obviously you have no revenues, so you've got to have some money. And then ultimately you start selling and your revenues start raising, and ultimately you reach a point of break even. You have to calculate that. But the cash flow will give you a really good idea of how much money, if you're negative cash for the first 6 months and the negative cash equals $500,000, that's how much you have to raise in your seed fund or something like that. Okay. Now scaling is a different kind of a story, but a cash flow, a good cash flow analysis, conservative cash flow analysis wins every time. In other words, if you think you got to raise $500,000 to start, you probably will want to raise 600,000 or 700,000. There's many ways to raise money, not just selling stock, right? But you need to determine that number, and you need to have conservative, believable estimates of both revenues ultimately and expenses, so you know how much you have to raise. And then there are many ways to raise money. As regards scaling, I think are you referring to manufacturing scaling?
Seeing it's a question from the user, I do not know if they can.
Okay. But I mean, scale is kind of when there's many forms of scaling. As you know, for example, if you're building the product yourself and you project that in 5 years you're going to need to build 1 million of these a year, you don't go off and raise money and build a big manufacturing facility, right? To make something you're not sure you're going to need, right? Spend millions of dollars. So what you might do, ultimately, maybe you want to make that product yourself because you can improve your profit margins. But what you might do is you might test your product in the market by going to a contract manufacturer, and you pay a little bit more for the product. But again, they're doing what Zappos did. They kind of wanted to reduce the cost at the front, and then they figured out what kind of shoes people wanted, or in your case, you figure out if you've got the right product before you invest money in facilities and equipment and people to build that product yourself. If that's what they're referring to in scaling, then that would be one way to kind of look at that. And I think most startups that are building products need to think very carefully about having a contractor build that product when they're in their early stages, because nobody wants to put their investment funds into a manufacturing facility and equipment that that may not they're too big for what the customers want. And so if that's what they refer to, that's what I think of when I think of scaling. So go to a contract manufacturer, start selling, make your money, and then you know a little bit more about what the customer wants. And if you want to build it yourself, go for it. Raise your 10 million or whatever you need to get your plant up and operating. So I hope that answers our question. But if not, they can come. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Brandon Price. We've had such a wonderful lesson. I've asked most of the questions that I had. And also, I do believe that our viewers have been, it was answered, by the way. It has been confirmed that the question was answered. So thank you very much, Dr. Brandon Price, once more. And at this point in time, I would just love to hand it over to you and see if you have any last words that you give as encouragements to people that have attended this session and people that are going to see this session afterwards concerning what we've discussed, and what are your final words on this particular topic?
Yeah, you've recorded it, so that's fine. It says there was one question here. It says, what are the most common mistakes entrepreneurs make when applying lean startup? Well, I don't know that it's mistakes, but they don't listen to customers when they do build, measure, learn. They think they are going to have a much more successful product, take a larger share of the market. They don't really understand the market. And if you got a moment, I'll give an example of that. One of my student teams down here in Mexico, their idea, or in the United States last year, was they wanted to build a lawnmower for cutting your lawns that is a robot, totally self-sufficient, right? And so they said, okay, they went and they said, well, how big is the market? Well, they came out in their business plan with the concept that the market for lawn care products in the U.S. was $200 billion. Okay, that's a nice number. But market for lawn care products is not lawnmowers, it's fertilizers, it's rakes, it's grass seed, it's services. What was their market? Well, there's a way to calculate market, and they did it incorrectly. The proper way to calculate it would have been to say, well, how many lawns are there that need mowing in the U.S.? Turns out there are 55 million. My device is going to cost $1,000. So that market, there was a market there, 55. Their market could have been as much as $500 billion. 55 million lawns times 1,000. So they had a much bigger market. They made a mistake. It's a marketing mistake, but there are all kinds of mistakes that entrepreneurs make, and it's kind of hard to pick one out. But maybe the biggest one is they overestimate the market and underestimate their ability to serve that market. So I'll just leave it at that. Anything else?
Right. I think
Cool.
there are no more questions left.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope people understood and enjoyed. So thank you very much.
We definitely
Thank you so much, Dr. Price.
Okay, take care. Have a good one. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Next week.
Cheers.
Bye.